There are moments when I feel that we live in a society filled with negative vibrations, hatred, psychic poisoning, and broken communication. In today's episode of Cultural Matrix, I want to reflect on this state of affairs, the kind of society that we are living in, and its implications. To begin with, it is important to acknowledge and understand, if we try to make sense of this crisis, the widespread culture of hatred, it is important that we realize what it means to live amid an ideology that leads the establishment to think that it holds the grand truth. And this grand non-problematic truth, as the establishment wants us to believe, is sanctified through certain discourses of nationalism and Indian/Hindu traditions. Now, when the establishment assumes that it occupies, it monopolizes, it holds that absolute grand truth, then any critical voice, any dissenting voice, and even the slightest ambiguity over it is seen necessarily as a conspiracy, as a deviance, as something dangerous which has to be ruthlessly annihilated. And that possibly makes us understand the politics of the vocabulary that we often see in our times. Just friends, think of some of the words which are often used in our political discourse today. For instance, urban Nakshals, Tukre Tukre gang, love jihadis, and for instance, recently at the time of the farmers' agitations, a new vocabulary, another vocabulary, that they are Khalistanis. The farmers are Khalistanis. So be it Tukre Tukre gang, Khalistani, urban Nakshals, or love jihadis, in these words, in these toxic words and terminologies, we essentially see and smell the conspiracy, the theory of conspiracy, that the establishment holds the grand truth, and that grand truth has to be legitimated through the discourse of nationalism and Hindu/Indian traditions, and any critical voice is therefore an act of conspiracy. So those young students who raise their voice against the discriminatory character of the Citizen Amendment Act are necessarily Maoist, urban Nakshals, or part of Tukre Tukre gang, or the farmers who are coming, who are agitating and asking the state to abolish the 3 laws. They are necessarily Khalistanis, anti-national conspirators. And those who experience the ecstasy of love, its healing touch, its ability to cross all borders and boundaries, and as a result, the possibility of a cross-religious marriage, Hindu or Muslim marriage, they are necessarily have to be condemned as the proponents of love jihad. And love jihad has to be now stigmatized, condemned, punished, stopped. So urban Nakshalites, love jihadis, or Tukre Tukre gang, these become negative connotations. This is like stigmatizing critique, stigmatizing dissent, and creating a culture of hatred. There are moments when, friends, I think that why it is happening in our time. I believe there are 2 reasons for that. The first reason is that any student of politics and political sociology, when the student to try to make sense of totalitarianism as an ideology. Now, any totalitarian ideology based on certain kind of extremist notion of the world, militant extremist notion of the world, is bound to generate a conspiracy theory. Because a totalitarian ideology, because of its very nature, is insecure, and it always suspects, avoids plurality of interpretations and the differences and plurality of living practices and multiple ways of seeing the world. It seeks to standardize, homogenize. It is fearful of alternative voices and the dissent because of its inherent insecurity. and it has its all color, left, right, all color. We could see the implications of totalitarian ideology at the time of Stalinism, how all those critical voices, even within the Marxist circuit, that could critique the terror of Stalinism are necessarily seen as conspirators. They were condemned, attacked, stigmatized, killed, punished. Likewise, the fascism, we could see that all critical creative voices were ruthlessly suppressed and killed, and many intellectual voices have to become exiled because totalitarian ideology could not bear them. Is it that something of that kind today we are also experiencing? We are seeing a form of totalitarianism which, because of its very nature, generates a conspiracy theory, and as a result, any dissenting, critical, creative voice that questions that grand truth that the establishment seeks to hold is seen as an act of criminality, and the dissent stigmatized, and dissenters now are condemned through certain negative words, right from jihadis to urban Naxals to Tukre gang. So I believe that it is important to look at the politics of this vocabulary and to see it in the context of the rise of a totalitarian ideology. But I think there is another reason. We are also living at a time of large-scale information revolution and the spectacular information revolution. It is a double-edged phenomenon. It could be used for democratizing human society, for generating positive news, creating a culture of communication, and at the same time, it could also be used for spreading venom, for spreading poison, for generating stereotypes and negativities. Something of this kind, I fear, is happening in our society with the propaganda machinery, which is engaged in spreading that poison, generating the stereotypes, popularizing the words like jihadis, urban Naxals, Tukre gang, anti-national. And as a result, a culture of hatred, a psychology of hatred is widely disseminated every moment, every second, every day. And as captive audience of that entire culture industry, of that information technology, quite often in the absence of a critical, reflexive education, we seek to consume it, digest it, take it for granted, and that vocabulary becomes our vocabulary. And how these words, these negative words, now enter into our everyday life, and we become increasingly toxic, and we carry that toxic messages and symbols. We become the embodiments of this toxic ideology. And this is something I believe that has to be reflected on. Friends, what I want to reflect on, that see its implication, and I urge you to see it beyond left and right, beyond party politics, and I want you to see its deeper implication. If we find ourselves in a society of this kind, where dissent is criminalized, where negative stereotypes are generated about all creative voices and the dissenters, then what happens? That eventually we lose three fundamental qualities as part of a larger community. And if we lose those three qualities, that is very dangerous. So the first thing that we lose is that the art of listening. It is important to evolve the art of listening, that skill, that ability, that when I could listen and listen peacefully and listen carefully with absolute mindfulness to the voices which go against my voice, which critique me, that art of listening without criminalizing, without stigmatizing the others with whom I differ. And Indian history shows in recent times Gandhi and Tagore, despite differences, engaged in that profound art of listening and learning from one another. They differed on many issues, but they didn't stigmatize one another. And that, I believe, was one of the important characteristics of a democratic society, art of listening. If we lose the art of listening, then another thing we lose, art of debate, art of conversation, art of negotiation. And democracy is about art of conversation, art of debate, art of negotiation. And when we lose art of listening, art of conversation, then we lose what sustains a society like ours, the plurality, heterogeneity, and differences. And the plurality and heterogeneity and differences and the multiple ways of seeing the world, seeing politics, seeing nationhood, seeing religion, seeing culture. And democracy requires that profound art of listening and conversation. Only then it is possible to acknowledge plurality and differences and the capacity to live with plurality and differences. And if we lose that, then we lose one of the fundamental features of a pluralist democratic society. And that's why I urge all of you to see the present crisis, particularly in this toxic polarized world, beyond left and right, beyond blame game, beyond partisan politics, and to understand its larger implications. If we lose listening and conversation and plurality, and if we allow the culture of hatred, and if we criminalize dissent and critical voices, then we end up in a society which is bound to be totalitarian, authoritarian, and we would only live amid violence, not only physical violence, cultural, psychic, spiritual violence, and that is terribly dangerous.